Camping had always been an escape for me, a way to leave behind the stress of work and city life. I had spent years exploring different forests and national parks, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened in the Daniel Boone National Forest in Kentucky. I went alone, something I had done dozens of times before. I enjoyed the solitude, the feeling of being completely disconnected from civilization. I had planned a 3-day trip, hiking deep into the woods, far from any official campsites. The first night was peaceful, just me, my tent, and the sounds of the forest. But on the second night, everything changed. I had just finished eating and was sitting by the fire when I heard something in the distance. Not an animal, not the wind, something different. It was rhythmic. A soft thump, 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 coming from deep within the woods. It sounded far away, but there was something unsettling about it. I told myself it was probably a woodpecker, or maybe a tree creaking in the wind. But the longer I listened, the more unnatural it felt. I tried to ignore it and went to bed. But as I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the fabric of my tent, the sound got closer. I held my breath. It was deliberate, steady, almost like footsteps, except they didn't belong to anything I could recognize. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent, and shined the beam into the trees. Nothing. Just the dense, endless forest stretching out before me. The noise had stopped. I zipped the tent back up and forced myself to sleep. But that night, I had the strangest dream. I was standing in the exact spot where I had set up camp. But everything was wrong. The trees were taller, their trunks twisted in unnatural shapes. The sky was a deep shade of red, and the fire I had built was nothing more than a pile of cold, gray ash. And then I saw them, figures standing in the trees, completely motionless. Their bodies were thin, elongated, almost stretched, like they had been pulled apart. They had no faces, just smooth, featureless skin where their eyes and mouths should have been. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They just watched. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding against my ribs. I sat up, gasping for breath, trying to convince myself it was just a nightmare. But then, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The fire had burned out. I had made sure to keep it going before I fell asleep. I had plenty of wood, and yet, it was completely dead. Not even embers remained. And worse, around my tent, in the dirt, were footprints. Not animal tracks, not even human footprints, but long, deep impressions in the earth, as if something impossibly tall had been standing there, watching me. I should have left then and there. Every instinct in my body told me to pack up and run. But I convinced myself I was being ridiculous. I had probably just sleepwalked, maybe stomped around in my sleep, leaving the strange impressions in the dirt. So I stayed. The next day, I went on a long hike, trying to shake off the fear. But the deeper I went into the forest, the more unsettled I felt. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves. Just a strange, heavy silence, like the entire forest was holding its breath. And then, I heard whispering. At first I thought it was the wind, but the more I listened, the more I realized. It was voices. They were everywhere, surrounding me, whispering just out of earshot. I couldn't make out the words, but they sounded distorted, like someone speaking underwater. I turned in a full circle, my heart racing. No one was there. That's when I noticed something. The trees had changed. When I had started my hike, the trees were normal, tall pines stretching into the sky. But now, they were twisted. Their trunks were bent at impossible angles, almost as if something had gripped them and twisted them like clay. Panic set in. I needed to get out of there. I turned around and walked back to camp as fast as I could, but the entire time, I felt watched. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't see anything, but I felt them, hiding just beyond my sight. By the time I reached my tent, the sun was setting. That night, the whispering returned, but this time, it was closer. Right outside my tent. I sat in my tent, clutching my knife in one hand and my flashlight in the other. The whispering was getting louder, more urgent. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it would stop. And then, a shadow passed over the tent. My breath hitched. Something was standing right outside. I could see its outline, tall and wrong, like it had been stretched beyond human proportions. The whispering stopped. The air was so thick I felt like I was drowning in silence. And then, the zipper of my tent began to move. Something was unzipping it. I didn't think. I just screamed and lashed out with my knife, slicing through the air. The shadow vanished. I scrambled out of the tent, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. No footprints. No sign of anything. But then I looked up, and there, perched in the trees above me, were figures, dozens of them, motionless, watching, their elongated limbs wrapped around the branches like unnatural insects. Their featureless faces turned toward me. I ran. I left everything behind, my tent, my gear, my supplies, and ran as fast as my legs could carry me. The entire time, I could hear them moving through the trees, following me, never making a sound. I didn't stop, not even when my lungs burned, not even when my legs screamed for rest. I ran until I burst out of the forest, into the parking lot where my car was waiting. I didn't even look back. I drove for hours, my hands shaking on the wheel. I still don't know what I saw that night, but I do know one thing. The forest is not empty. There are things watching us, waiting in the trees. And the next time you go camping, you might hear them whispering. There you have it. Another terrifying camping story that proves the wilderness holds secrets we were never meant to find. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more chilling stories. And remember, when the forest goes silent, you should leave, because something is watching you. I was 17 when my uncle invited me to join him on a solo camping trip deep in the woods of Montana. He had been going to the same remote spot for years, and I figured it would be a great bonding experience. The first day was perfect. Hiking, fishing, and sitting by the campfire under the vast open sky. But that night, something changed. Around midnight, a dense fog rolled in, swallowing the trees and making everything eerily quiet. I was lying in my tent, listening to the occasional crackle of the dying fire, when I heard it. Soft footsteps crunching against the damp leaves. I held my breath. "Uncle Dan?" I whispered. No answer. The footsteps grew closer. I unzipped my tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had nearly died out, casting weak, flickering shadows across the trees. And then, I saw him. A figure stood just beyond the reach of the light, not moving, just standing there. I felt frozen, my breath caught in my throat. "Uncle Dan?" I tried again, my voice barely above a whisper. Then, without a sound, the figure took a step closer. The firelight revealed something horrifying. His face wasn't right. His eyes were hollow, deep black pits, and his mouth was twisted into a stretched, unnatural grin. His clothes were tattered, hanging from his body like they had been chewed up by time. I I scrambled backward, knocking over a lantern inside my tent. The sudden movement must have scared him, because he suddenly bolted, disappearing into the fog. I sat there trembling until my uncle came rushing back to camp. He had gone to fetch more firewood and had seen nothing. But the look on my face was enough. We packed up and left that night. The next morning, we drove past an old, weathered sign at the entrance of the trail, something neither of us had noticed before. It read, "Warning, area closed. Missing persons reported." This happened to my older sister and her friends on a camping trip in Oregon. They were seasoned hikers, used to backpacking deep into the wilderness, but nothing could have prepared them for what they encountered that night. They had set up camp near a small, quiet lake, surrounded by thick pine trees. The first day was uneventful, just the usual campfire stories and roasting marshmallows. But then, in the dead of night, my sister woke up to a strange sound, whispering. She held her breath, listening. The voices were faint, like they were coming from the trees just outside the tent. She nudged her best friend, Lisa, who groggily stirred awake. "Do you hear that?" my sister whispered. Lisa's eyes widened as she strained to listen. The whispering grew louder, but the words were indistinguishable. A garbled mess, like someone speaking a language that didn't belong to this world. And then, the tent fabric shifted. Something pressed against it, dragging along the material, as if tracing its fingers from the outside. Lisa let out a muffled gasp, covering her mouth. They lay there, frozen, as the whispering continued. Then, all at once, it stopped. Dead silence. The air was thick with tension, like the forest itself was holding its breath. After what felt like hours, my sister gathered the courage to unzip the tent an inch. Just enough to peek outside. Nothing. Just the dark trees standing still. The next morning, they packed up in record time, hiking back to their car without saying much. But just before they left, Lisa turned around to take one last look at the campsite. And there, in the dirt surrounding their tent, were footprints. Bare footprints, circling their tent over and over again.